Hello and welcome to Daily Chapter Reading, Chapter 8 of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies by Jane Austen and Seth Grahame-Smith. At 5 o'clock, Elizabeth retired to meditate and dress, and at 6:30 she was summoned to dinner. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, how much and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves, and then thought no more of this matter. Their indifference towards Jane would not immediately before them restored Elizabeth to her former dislike. Their brother, Mr. Bingley, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attention to herself most pleasing, and they prevented her feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed she was considered by the others. When dinner was over, Elizabeth returned directly to Jane, and Miss Bingley began abusing her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She had no conversation, no style, no beauty. Mrs. Hurst thought the same, and added, "She has nothing, in short, to recommend her, but being well schooled in the ways of combat. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. Why must she be scampering about the country in such dangerous times because her sister had a cold? Her hair so untidy, so blousy?" "Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat, 6 inches deep in mud, I am absolutely certain, and pieces of undead flesh upon her sleeve, no doubt from her attackers." "Your picture may be very exact, Louisa," said Bingley, "but this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice." "You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure," said Mrs. Bingley, "and I am inclined to think that you should not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition." "Certainly not. To walk 3 miles or whatever it is above her ankles in dirt, and alone, quite alone, with the unmentionable menace dragging poor souls off the road into their doom day and night. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country-town indifference to decorum." "It shows an affection to her sister that is very pleasing," said Mr. Bingley. "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," observed Miss Bingley in a half-whisper, "that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." "Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." A short pause followed this speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. "I have an excessive regard for Miss Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it." "I think I have heard you say that their uncle is an attorney on Meryton." "Yes, and they have another, who lives somewhere near Cheapside." "That is capital," added her sister, and they both laughed heartily. "And if they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside," cried Bingley, "it would not make them one jot less agreeable. Have you no regard for them as warriors? Indeed, I have never seen ladies so steady-handed in combat." "But it must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in this world," replied Darcy. To this speech Bingley made no answer, but his sisters gave it to their hearty assent. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they returned to Jane's room on leaving the dining parlour, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all, till late in the evening, when she had the comfort of seeing her sleep, and when it seemed to her rather right than pleasant that she should go downstairs herself. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at cards, and was immediately invited to join them. But suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it, and making her sister the excuse, said she would amuse herself with the short time she could stay below with a book. Mrs. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. "Do you prefer reading to cards?" said her. "That is rather singular." "I prefer a great many things to cards, Mr. Hurst," said Elizabeth, not the least of which is the sensation of a newly sharpened blade as it punctures the round belly of a man. Mr. Hurst was silent for the remainder of the evening. "In nursing your sister I am sure you have pleasure," said Bingley, "and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well." Elizabeth thanked him, and then walked towards the table where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. "And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit. And I'm an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever looked into." Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. "I am astonished," said Miss Bingley, "that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy." "It ought to be good," he replied. "It has been the work of many generations." "And then you have added so much to yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. What have we to do but stay indoors and read till the cure is at last discovered?" Elizabeth turned her attention away from her book and drew near the card table, and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to observe the game. "Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring?" said Miss Bingley. "Will she be as tall as I am?" "I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller. How I long to see her again! I never met with anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age." "It is amazing to me," said Bingley, "how many ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they all are." "All young ladies accomplished? My dear Charles, what do you mean?" "They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I am sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was very accomplished." "The word is applied," said Darcy, "to many a woman who deserves it no otherwise than by netting a purse or covering a screen. My sister Georgiana deserves the distinction, however, for she is not only master of the female arts, but the deadly as well. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen, in the whole range of my acquaintance, that are thus accomplished." "Nor I am sure," said Miss Bingley. "Then, Mr. Darcy," observed Elizabeth, "you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman." "A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages. She must be well trained in the fighting styles of the Kyoto masters and the modern tactics and weaponry of Europe. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. All this she must possess, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. In my experience, a woman is either highly trained or highly refined. One cannot afford the luxury of both in such times. As for my sisters and I, our dear father thought it best that we give less of our time to books and music, and more to protecting ourselves from the sorry stricken." Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, and were both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description, when Mr. Hurst called them to order. All conversation was thereby at an end. Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room. "Elizabeth Bennet," said Miss Bingley, when the door was closed on her, "is one of those 6 ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, and with many men, I dare say, it succeeds. But, in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art." "Undoubtedly," replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. "There is a meanness in all of the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable." Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. Elizabeth joined them again, only to say that her sister was worse, and that she could not leave her. Bingley urged Mr. Jones being sent for immediately, while his sisters, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended an express to town for one of the most eminent physicians. This she would not hear of. It was too dangerous to dispatch a rider at night. But she was willing to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning, if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every attention might be paid to the sick lady and her sister.